이번에는 그 PBS사에서 제작된 Your Inner Fish, 몸의 비밀, An Evolution Story 3부작 중에 2부인 Your Inner Reptile이죠. 우리 안의 파충류입니다. 우리 안의 파충류는 인체가 어떻게 지금같이 발달했는지에 대한 내용을 다루는 거죠. 피부, 털, 복잡한 치아, 뛰어난 청각 등 이런 것들이 모두 파충류에 거슬러 올라간다 이 얘기죠. 그 캐나다 파르스보로에서 화석을 굉장히 많이 발굴하게 된 거죠. 그 중에 트라이텔레돈트라는 그 파충류에서 포유류로 전환되는 그런 중간 단계의 동물의 화석을 발견한 거죠.
This site yielded thousands of pieces of bone from a momentous period in our history.
We found loads of things, but the real gem is in here. What you're seeing here is an upper jaw. There's a canine tooth, and a series of other smaller teeth behind it.
These 200 million-year-old teeth belong to a creature called a tritheledont. It may look like an insignificant little animal, but it's unlike anything alive today.
Now what we have here is a really unique kind of animal with a unique mix of features. Part reptile, part mammal. We see it in its skull, in its jaws, in its limb bones, virtually every feature of its anatomy.
This is a creature right on the cusp of the transition from reptile to mammal. A key moment in the evolution of the human body. Trace your ancestry way back in time, and you'll find an ancient relative. A fish-like creature that crawled from the water onto land about 375 million years ago. Animals like this gave rise to amphibians, and more important to our story, reptiles. Over time, one line of reptiles gave rise to early mammals, and eventually to us. But before you get the idea this was one smooth ride, your reptilian ancestors faced a rocky road. They would colonize a hostile land. Compete for food and territory. And even deal with the worst mass extinction the world had ever seen.
그리고 이 닐 시빈 교수가 운이 좋게 이제 인공수정 클리닉에 참여할 기회가 주어진 거죠. 허락을 받아가지고 CT인가요? CT인지 뭔지 하여튼 그 촬영을 보면은 거기에 보면 그 배아 초기 단계에 그 난황주머니가 보여요. 그 난황주머니는 바로 알을 낳던 흔적이죠. 옛날에 파충류 시절에 물속에서 이제 올라온 건데, 물속에서 있을 때는 항상 물속에 있으니까 물을 접하고 있잖아요. 근데 육지로 올라오면은 물을 접하지 못하죠. 근데 물이 필수인데 물을 그러니까 잡아둬야 되죠. 어딘가. 파충류에 와서 그 방법을 찾은 겁니다. 그 양서류는 알을 낳으려면 물속으로 들어가야 돼요. 파충류는 알을 낳을 때 어떤 양막이라는 양막 안에다가 알을 낳는 거예요. 그 양막이 물을 간직하기 때문에 그 물속으로 들어갈 필요가 없는 거죠. 파충류는. 근데 이제 양막이 약하니까 양막을 둘러싼 껍데기도 발달한다는 얘기죠. 그 껍데기가 발달하고 나니까 해안에다가 알을 낳고 물로 돌아갈 필요는 없고 육지정복에 나설 수 있는 거죠. 그러니까 뭐 해안가나 강가에 알을 낳고 육지정복에 나선 거죠. 그렇게 됐다는 얘기죠.
First few weeks of pregnancy, it's almost as if the embryo is a window back in time that reveals our evolutionary history.
This is the head, this is the heart, and this is the tail. And here's the yolk sac.
Oh, let's see. Oh, wow, there you go. You know, you don't think about yolk in a human, right? You think of yolk for chicken eggs.
Chicken eggs.
Is that extra large or?
When you think of yolk, you don't think of humans. But we have a little yolk sac in early development that gets smaller and smaller as the embryo develops.
There's no yolk inside. It's a remnant from a time when our ancestors laid eggs. And that's not the only gift they left us.
This little bright white line around there is the amnion. And then the black around the baby is the amniotic fluid.
The amnion forms a fluid-filled sac that cushions the embryo. When a mother's waters break, this is the sac that bursts.
That little tissue represents something that happened hundreds of millions of years ago and our connection to one of the great events in the history of life.
They searched for a particular kind of gene that produces yolk in the egg. Reptiles and birds have several of these yolk genes that produce gobs of yolk protein to feed the embryo.
Guess what? When researchers looked at humans, what did they find? They found we too have yolk genes, but they're no longer functional. They're knocked out. They're derelicts.
That's because long ago, our ancestors stopped relying on yolk to nourish their embryos. The yolk genes began to decay, until eventually they produced no yolk at all. But those broken genes still lie buried in our genome, like fossils from the past.
So what the genes tell us, what DNA tells us, is that we have come from an egg-laying animal. We're related to egg layers. We're related to reptiles. We carry the genetic signature of our eggy past inside of us.
알을 낳은 흔적은 DNA에도 기록되어 있다. 그러니까 난황유전자를 모두 가지고 있는 거예요. 그리고 그 흔적은 인간의 유전자에도 있는 거예요. 몸이 마르는 것을 방지하기 위해 죽은 세포들이 몸을 감싸는 방식으로 피부가 발달했다. 그러니까 몸에도 항상 물이 필요한 거죠. 수분이. 물에서 왔으니까. 수분이 필수인데 그게 자꾸 이제 육지에 올라가고 말라버리니까 그거를 방지하기 위해서 죽은 세포들이 몸을 감싼다는 얘기죠. 포유류는 피부에 수분을 공급하는 쪽으로 발달하여 부드럽고 탄력이 있다. 이런 얘기죠. 하여튼 그 뱀이 허물을 벗는 거를 보면은 그게 그 껍질이 죽은 세포들이죠. 그것들이 이제 몸을 감싸고 있는 거죠. 이 치아는 이 피부랑 상관이 없을 것 같은데 치아가 피부에서 온 거다 이런 얘기죠. 털이라든가 치아라든가 이런 것들이 전부 피부에서 온 거다 이거예요. 그래서 우리가 치아를 보면은 많은 것을 추리할 수 있다는 거죠. 그 프랑스의 조르주 퀴에르라는 남작은 치아만 보여주면 동물 전체를 그릴 수 있다고 장담을 했다는 건데, 그러니까 그 치아를 보고 이건 코끼리 치아다, 이거는 뭐 사자의 치아다 이런 걸 이제 알 수가 있다는 얘기죠.
Teeth. For anatomists, teeth can reveal a lot about an animal's life.
One of the great anatomists of all time was Baron Georges Cuvier, who lived in Paris in the 1800s. Who was remarkably important, remarkably smart, and remarkably arrogant. He had a boast. and his boast was, "Show me the tooth of any animal, and I can reconstruct its entire skeleton." Turns out Cuvier was pretty much right. And here's a tooth. This is a huge tooth. Clearly came from a big animal. Flat surface on top. That animal clearly chews plant material. What is a big animal that eats plants? An elephant. Here's another one. Large canines, big scissor-like teeth in the back. This creature clearly, is built to eat meat. This is a lion. So teeth contain so many answers to the basic biology of creatures.
그 남아프리카 공화국에 가면 카루곤이라고 있는데 거기에는 포유류형 파충류의 화석들이 널려 있다 그래요. 이게 이런 것들이 다 중간 단계의 화석인 거죠. 2억 5천만 년 전에 고르곤옵시드라고 공룡전에 나타났던 동물이 있는데 이 고르곤옵시드는 파충류에서 포유류를 바뀌는 그런 동물이란 얘기죠. 파충류의 치아는 무는 데 적합하지만 씹지는 못한다는 얘기죠. 그래서 악어 보면 알지만 그냥 삼켜버리는 거죠. 그리고 그 파충류의 치아는 굉장히 불규칙적이죠. 띄엄띄엄 나고 좀 징어때리처럼 보이죠. 이 길어진 송곳니가 바로 포유류의 특징을 보여주는 거죠. 송곳니로 가죽을 뜯고 앞니로 고기를 뜯어낸다. 인간이 연구치로 발달한 이유는 정밀한 교합 때문이다. 이거 씹어야 되니까 이빨이 교합이 정밀해야 된다는 얘기예요. 그래서 그게 연구치가 됐다는 얘기죠.
Oh, wow, look at that.
Ferocious. Look at those teeth.
Now, this is the Gorgonopsid. These are the carnivores of that time.
Boy, the teeth really tell a story on that one.
Certainly do, yeah.
Gorgonopsids might look a bit like T-Rex, but they lived millions of years before any dinosaur was around.
This is a fossil that when you see it, you know exactly how it lived, what it did, This wasn't messing around, this creature. I mean,
Absolutely, yeah.
Gorgonopsids were ferocious predators with mouths full of highly specialized teeth. And that represents a dramatic change from the much more basic teeth of reptiles. Most reptiles have sharp peg-shaped teeth that all look really similar. These teeth are only great for one thing: biting. They can't strip or chew their food. Instead, they tear off chunks and then swallow them whole. The Gorgonopsid's teeth had come a long way from their reptilian cousins.
Compared to the reptiles before it, there was no differentiation of incisors and canines, but this elongation of the canine is a particularly mammal-like feature. And the front teeth were like two little needles that came together. Very, very well adapted for flesh tearing.
So here you start to see differentiation along the tooth row. They're all sort of the same shape, but they're different sizes, specialized in different ways.
Gorgonopsids had virtual Swiss Army knives of teeth. Giant canines for piercing tough skin, and incisors for stripping flesh off a carcass, so they could avoid swallowing whole bones. Never before had such menacingly efficient eating machines ruled the land.
These particular Gorgonopsians were fairly long-legged, and the front legs were slightly sprawled, the back legs were nice and upright. So even in their gait, they're somewhat between a reptile and a mammal.
Over millions of years, back teeth would also become more specialized. They developed extra ridges called cusps for chewing food, allowing more efficient digestion and more energy for chasing prey. These ancient innovations were the precursors to the molars we have in our mouths today.
An accident.
Wow, that is just absolutely beautiful. Do you know how lucky you are to find things like this? This is
Yeah.
great.
It was quite a sensation to find that. The way they are lying, this body beautifully curled around, this one lying straight, it really looks like the burrow has collapsed on these and just preserved them as they were sleeping or hibernating.
So what do you know about the biology of these creatures, just from what we're seeing here, the skeletons?
Its teeth clearly show that it had an insectivorous diet, beetles, cockroaches, that sort of thing. It has large eyes. It appears to have been nocturnal, or at least in the dawn and dusk, where they would come out of their burrows to hunt insects.
Hair? That's the million-dollar question. Does Thrinaxodon have hair?
We prefer not to reconstruct Thrinaxodon with full body hair, but we do have evidence around the cheeks, so whiskers around the lower jaw, as well as on the maxilla around here. So more as a sensory organ than a thermoregulation.
These pits on the skull suggest that Thrinaxodon had whiskers, just like a cat or a dog today. And although we can't be completely certain, there's no evidence that it had hair anywhere else.
So a hairless guy with whiskers at the front.
That's right, yeah. Very much a half and half animal.
If we could go back in time and venture deep underground, we'd see that hair may have first evolved as a sensory organ. Whiskers would have helped Thrinaxodon to navigate inside its burrow. And when it emerged at dusk, they were used to find its way in the dark. It's thought that over millions of years, our distant relatives got hairier and hairier. And by 50 million years after Thrinaxodon, they had started using hair for a new purpose: to keep warm.
피부가 털, 치아, 귓뼈 등으로 발전을 한다.
You need really steady hands for this kind of work.
Here I'm using a tungsten needle, but for very small tissue, we glue an eyelash to a glass stick and use that as a really fine little knife. It's starting to go now. There we go. So here we're looking at a tooth at the bud stage. It hasn't really sort of got a tooth shape yet. So it was a flat sheet and now it's pushed its way in, forming this sort of bud shape.
After placing the tooth bud in an incubator, Abigail can observe how it grows. And what she sees is remarkable. The skin folds in upon itself, very much like watching origami.
And now you really can see that that's formed a tooth, and it's not just any old tooth, it's a molar tooth with all these nice cusps developing here.
And the tooth is just the beginning. All our skin organs, from hairs to glands, are formed in a similar way, from simple folds in skin tissue.
We think that this is a really sort of ancient principle. It's this sort of folding that was one of the first steps to be able to actually then go on from a very simple skin to something with lots of different organs developing within it.
Once the process of folding skin was in place, it could be modified to produce all kinds of skin organs, from a reptile's scale to a bird's feather, and even that defining body feature of mammals, mammary glands. And what's surprising is the formation of all skin organs is controlled by a single master gene called EDA.
EDA we know is very important for doing things like controlling how hairy you are, therefore how many hairs you form in a particular area, or how many teeth.
스타트rek에 출연했던 마이클 베리먼이라는 배우는 선천적으로 ED 유전자의 결함이 있다.
I started realizing I had issues with my skin. For instance, no fingernails. I have 2 nails here, one here, one here, one here, and one here. The rest are not fully developed. There were areas that were just raw meat, where there was no dermis on it at all. But I also realized that I had no teeth. The teeth that I had to be removed. I've worn dentures my entire life. It also affected me in a manner of which I cannot dissipate body heat, which is absolutely huge.
Yeah. I mean, you're an actor. You're under hot lights. I mean, what do you do? What are the...
Well, the acting came about secondary to my chosen profession, which was food and beverage. I had a restaurant. I was on my way to be a chef. I started to realize that I would overheat quite readily. So the only way in which I could dissipate the body heat was actually physically, meaning I would go into a freezer that was 20 below zero.
Wow.
And breathe slowly and deeply to cool the blood in my lungs.
So sweat glands, fingertips and nails, hair?
Yes.
As well?
Teeth.
Teeth. I mean, these are all skin organs, so you of all people understand just how important skin is.
Yeah, I like it when it's healthy.
Michael's skin condition demonstrates the crucial role EDA has had in shaping our bodies.
You know, when we look at evolution, you know, we don't inherit structures from our ancestors. I mean, I didn't inherit an elbow, from the fish we found up in the Arctic. What we inherit are the developmental processes, the genes, the manufacturing processes, if you will, to build those organs. And EDA was a very important part of our evolutionary history.
중위에 있는 3개의 뼈는 파충류의 턱뼈에서 온 것이다.
These are the 3 bones of our middle ear. All mammals, including people, have these 3 bones that sit inside the skull. And what they do is they form a little lever system that turns the vibration of air into sound that our nervous system can perceive. We, like all mammals, have 3 of these bones in our middle ear, but reptiles only have 1.
These 2 extra bones, the malleus and incus, enable us to amplify sounds that reach our eardrum. Which is one reason why our hearing is so much better than reptiles. This presents us with a simple yet extraordinary puzzle. How did our acute sense of hearing using 3 bones can trace the development of the middle ear bones from embryo to adult? And what the skulls reveal is astonishing.
So what's really surprising is if you look at these early opossum embryos, what you see is essentially a reptilian-style ear with 1 ear bone. Those 2 extra middle ear bones, they're going to be in the ear in the adult. They are part of the jaw. And so the jaw joint between the skull and the jaw really looks like that of a reptile. Then after they're born and while they're growing up, those little bones that are going to be the mammalian middle ear disconnect from the jaw. They get relatively smaller and move up to their final position to become a mammal-like ear. So if you have modern reptiles with 1 ear bone, you have modern mammals with 3 ear bones. I think what the embryos do is they almost provide a link between those 2.
When you get to animals that lived around 200 million years ago, more recent in the fossil record, you find that they have formed a completely new jaw joint. That's because the bone that holds the teeth had grown so large it made contact with the skull. So over millions of years, bones that formed the old jaw joint began to shrink and eventually became redundant. But instead of being lost altogether, these old jaw bones were repurposed to take up a new role in the ear.
중국에서 죄악될 만한 화석이 발견되었는데 조사해보니 포유류의 두개골이었고 치아, 턱뼈, 귓뼈, 뇌 등의 연구에서 상당히 중요한 화석이었다.
Had cusps like other mammals. But it's the lower jaw that really stood out. The jaw joint looked remarkably like that of modern mammals, which suggests that the old reptilian jaw bones were no longer being used to eat with. They had become part of the ear. Hadrocodium's ear bones were on their way to being completely separate. So this 195-million-year-old creature, no bigger than a paperclip, had taken a big step towards the kind of hearing we have today. Along with its specialized teeth and fur coat, Hadrocodium is regarded as one of the earliest mammals. And there was a final surprise. Another important mammalian feature inside its skull.
We originally thought the early mammals' brain were a lot smaller, but Hadrocodium really surprised us. It has a huge brain. In fact, its brain is 50% bigger relative to its body mass than anything before it. That's why we call the fossil Hadrocodium. It means it got a great big brain.
The rise of a new kind of reptile, the dinosaurs, forced the early mammals to become tiny creatures of the night. From smelling to hearing to touching with their whiskers, processing so much sensory information caused their brains to grow. They hunted in the dark and hid in their burrows during the day. Many of them maintained that lifestyle for over 130 million years. Only when the dinosaurs were wiped out in yet another mass extinction 65 million years ago could the mammals truly emerge and flourish.
The more you look at fossils, the more you look at embryos, the more you see that we're repurposed reptiles. The jaw I'm using to talk with, the teeth I used to eat with, the ear bones I used to hear with, the skin and the structures that appear within it that arose in our reptile past. So in a very real sense, every day we feel the consequences of our inner reptile.